The wind howled a primeval song, rattling the very foundations of Clay Morgan's cabin. Rain, thick as shot, hammered against the single window, blurring the already dim light of late afternoon into an impenetrable gray. Clay stood by the stove, a mug of steaming coffee clutched in his large hands, watching the tempest rage. This wasn't just a storm, it was a beast, tearing at the land with a fury he hadn't seen in years. The old cottonwoods by the creek bent double, their branches thrashing like desperate arms, and the distant rumble of thunder felt less like sound and more like the earth itself groaning under duress. He checked the livestock earlier, pulling the horses into the relative shelter of the barn, but a nagging worry had him tugging on his slicker again. The wind tried to rip the door from his grasp as he wrestled it open, a torrent of cold water instantly soaking through his clothes. Head bent against the deluge, he fought his way towards the barn, the lantern he carried swinging wildly, its beam swallowed by the swirling chaos. The barn door, usually a heavy, stubborn thing, was ajar. Clay frowned, his brow furrowing deeper. He distinctly remembered latching it tight. Pushing it open further, a gust of wind shrieked through the opening, sending loose hay scattering. The horses shifted uneasily in their stalls, their eyes wide and nervous in the flickering light. "Who's there?" Clay's voice, rough against the storm's roar, hung in the air. He held the lantern aloft, its weak glow cutting through the gloom. A low whimper answered him, not from an animal, but distinctly human. His gaze swept the barn's interior, past the familiar shapes of feed sacks and tack, until it settled on a huddle of blankets tucked into a corner of the hayloft. His heart gave a jolt, a cold knot tightening in his gut. Strangers. Here. In his barn. He climbed the ladder, each step deliberate, the wood creaking under his weight. As he drew closer, the whimpering grew clearer, unmistakably a baby's cry. He reached the loft, holding the lantern higher, and the light illuminated a sight that made him pause, his breath catching in his throat. A woman, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, huddled protectively over a small bundle. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dim light, met his, a flash of fear, then a defiant spark. She couldn't be much older than 30, though the grime and exhaustion etched on her face made her look older. Despite the circumstances, her features were striking, framed by strands of dark, rain-streaked hair. "Who are you?" Clay demanded, his voice devoid of warmth. He felt a surge of anger, an intrusion on his solitary world, mingled with a reluctant flicker of concern for the shivering woman and the tiny bundle she clutched. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We didn't have anywhere else to go. The storm. We just needed shelter." She pulled the blanket tighter around the baby, whose cries had softened to soft whimpers. Clay's gaze narrowed. He took in her mud-caked boots, the torn hem of her dress, the gauntness of her cheeks. She looked like she'd been running, and not just from the storm. His mind, usually slow to suspicion, raced through possibilities. Outlaws, vagrants. He'd heard stories, seen too much of the ugliness the frontier could breed. His hand instinctively went to the Colt holstered at his hip, a silent warning. "This is my ranch," he stated, his voice hard. "You shouldn't be here." The woman flinched, but her chin lifted slightly. "I know," she said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "And I'm sorry. We would have frozen out there. Please, just for the night. We'll be gone by first light." The baby let out another weak cry, a tiny, helpless sound that cut through Clay's hardened resolve. He looked at the child, then back at the woman's pleading eyes. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she looked desperate, utterly spent. He imagined himself turning them out, forcing them back into the teeth of that raging storm, a woman and a baby, and a bitter taste filled his mouth. He might be a solitary man, distrustful of strangers, but he wasn't a monster. "Fine," he grunted, the word feeling like grit in his throat. He hated the weakness in his own voice, hated the way this unexpected encounter was unsettling the carefully constructed walls around his life. "But you'll come to the cabin. You'll freeze in here." He watched her closely, expecting relief, perhaps even gratitude. Instead, a fresh wave of fear flickered in her eyes. "The cabin," she repeated, her grip on the baby tightening. "It's warmer," Clay said, impatient with her hesitation. "And I'll need answers. Who are you? And whose baby is that?" His voice carried a steely edge, an unspoken threat. He didn't know who she was or what trouble she carried with her, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't be leaving his sight until he had some understanding of the storm she'd brought into his quiet life. He had a bad feeling about this, a creeping sense that his peace, meticulously cultivated over years, was about to be shattered. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something close to dread. The woman hesitated for another long moment, her gaze searching his face as if weighing her options, assessing the danger he represented against the terror of the storm outside. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, she nodded. "My name is Sophie," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And this baby isn't mine." The wind howled, a banshee shriek against the sturdy logs of the cabin. But inside, the silence stretched taut, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic drip of melting snow from the eaves. Lily, swaddled tightly, slept soundly on the floor beside the hearth, her tiny chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. Clay watched Sophie watch the child, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. "All right," he said, his voice rough, cutting through the quiet. "Start talking, and don't leave anything out." Sophie flinched, her gaze tearing away from Lily to meet his. Her eyes, a startling shade of green against the pallor of her face, held a weariness that belied her youthful features. She took a steadying breath, her hands clenching in her lap. "My name is Sophie Lane," she began, her voice a soft murmur against the storm's fury. "I was traveling west, hoping to find work and independence. My wagon broke down a few days' ride from here. I was lucky enough to stumble upon a small, isolated cabin where a woman offered me shelter." She paused, a shadow passing over her face. She seemed kind at first, but her husband and sons, they were a rough lot, always coming and going, horses saddled at all hours, whispers about jobs and hauls. Clay's jaw tightened. He knew the type. "A few nights ago," Sophie continued, her voice gaining a desperate edge, "they brought Lily. She was just a few weeks old, no more. They'd taken her from a family they'd robbed. Said her parents put up a fight. They were going to leave her out for the wolves." Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard. I couldn't let them. I just couldn't. I told them I'd care for her, make her useful when she was older. Anything to keep her safe. Clay's gaze flickered to Lily, then back to Sophie. He saw the genuine anguish in her eyes, the fierce protectiveness that radiated from her small frame. It didn't sound like a lie. They were careless, she went on, a spark of defiance in her gaze. Left the cabin door unlatched, thinking I wouldn't dare. But that night, the storm started to brew, and I knew it was my only chance. I wrapped Lily in a blanket, grabbed what little food I could, and slipped out. She shivered, despite the warmth of the fire. I've been traveling ever since, mostly through the night, trying to stay ahead of them. I heard them talking about the sheriff in Silver Creek, how he was too far to be a threat. I thought, if I could just get to him, explain everything, he could help Lily find her real family. Clay leaned back in his chair, studying her. He had seen fear, desperation, and deceit in his life, but there was an honesty in Sophie's account that pricked at his hardened shell. The way she had spoken of the child, the quiet resolve in her eyes, it resonated with a part of him he rarely acknowledged. You're telling me you stole a baby from outlaws, and you're running to the law? He asked, a hint of skepticism still in his voice. That's a bold move, ma'am. What else could I do? She pleaded, her hands twisting. Leave her to die? I might be a stranger, Mr. Morgan, but I'm not a monster. The wind rattled the window panes, and the cabin groaned under the assault. Outside, the world was a swirling vortex of white, visibility zero. No one was going anywhere, not until the storm broke. He watched her for a long moment, the quiet hum of the storm filling the silence. He saw the way her fingers instinctively smoothed the blanket over Lily, the soft, almost imperceptible murmur she made when the baby stirred in her sleep. He wasn't a fool. He knew trouble when he saw it. But he also knew a desperate soul, and the woman before him, for all her mysterious arrival, seemed to be just that. And these outlaws, he finally said, his voice low. They know you have the child. They're looking for you. Sophie nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. They'll be furious. They don't like to be made fools of. A flicker of something akin to grim satisfaction crossed Clay's face. He could imagine. He pushed himself out of the chair, walking over to the window, peering out into the swirling white chaos. The storm offered a temporary reprieve, a shroud of invisibility. But it wouldn't last forever. When it broke, the world would be exposed, and so would they. He turned back to Sophie, his eyes hard, but something else, something unreadable, simmered beneath the surface. You brought trouble to my door, Sophie Lane, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But you also brought a child, and I don't turn my back on a helpless babe. Not even for a pack of wolves. He picked up a log, tossing it onto the fire with a resounding thud. Sparks flew, momentarily illuminating the tense lines of his face. The storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of storm was just beginning to brew. Shared shelters, shared stories. The blizzard howled like a banshee, rattling the windows of Clay's small cabin. 2 days they'd been holed up, the storm a relentless warden, trapping them in an uneasy truce. Clay sat by the hearth, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, almost ritualistic care, the rhythmic click and scrape the only sound besides the wind's fury. Sophie, curled on a worn armchair, had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, Lily nestled against her chest, a tiny bundle of warmth and innocence. He watched them from the corner of his eye, the soft glow of the fire painting Sophie's features in hues of amber and rose. She was younger than he'd first thought, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes deepening in sleep. Yet even in repose, a fierce protectiveness radiated from her, a palpable shield around the infant. He remembered the raw courage in her voice when she'd spoken of the outlaws, the quiet determination in her gaze. It was a strength he hadn't expected, not from a woman fleeing with a baby. On the first night, after the immediate chaos of their arrival, he'd pressed her for details. Sophie had spoken in hushed tones, the firelight dancing across her face, revealing the flicker of fear that still haunted her. She described the ambush, the desperate struggle, the whimpers of an infant she'd stumbled upon. "They were animals," she'd whispered, her voice cracking. "I couldn't just leave her." He'd seen the truth in her eyes, the genuine anguish, and something else, a flicker of outrage that resonated with a long-buried part of himself. "My folks were just passing through," she'd explained, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Heading west. My pa, he was a carpenter, always dreaming of building a new life out there." She'd smiled then, a wistful, heartbreaking expression. "Ma, she just followed him, wherever he led. Always said, as long as we're together, we're home." The storm outside seemed to listen, its intensity momentarily softening. "They were good people, kind. They taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." He grunted, a non-committal sound, but a knot in his chest loosened. Her story, raw and unembellished, had the ring of truth. He pictured her, a young woman, perhaps not much older than Lily's true mother, thrust into a nightmare. He'd seen plenty of desperate folks in his time, but few with her particular brand of resilience. Later that evening, when Lily's soft cries had stirred Sophie awake, Clay had found himself fetching warm milk, a gesture so uncharacteristic he almost startled himself. He'd watched as Sophie, with gentle hands, fed the infant, humming a tuneless lullaby. He remembered his own mother, her hands worn from years of work, but always soft when she held him. A memory, long suppressed, surfaced. His father teaching him to mend a broken fence, the quiet pride in his eyes. "You're good with her," he'd observed gruffly, surprised by his own words. Sophie had looked up, a faint smile gracing her lips. "She's a survivor, just like her mama was." Her gaze drifted to the rifle in his lap. "You clean that thing often?" "Every week," he'd replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "Keeps it reliable." She'd nodded. "Smart. My pa always said, a man's tools are an extension of his will." She paused, her eyes tracing the familiar contours of his cabin. "You built this place yourself, didn't you?" He hesitated, then gave another grunt of affirmation. "Took me a year. After everything." He didn't elaborate, but the unspoken weight of his past hung in the air between them. He'd come here to escape, to build a wall around himself, brick by solitary brick. Now that wall had a gaping hole, and two unexpected guests had walked right through it. He'd caught her watching him, a thoughtful, almost curious expression on her face as he'd meticulously chopped firewood, or when he'd carefully placed a worn blanket over Lily. He didn't like being observed, not usually, but there was no judgment in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. It was disarming. The second morning, as the storm showed no signs of abating, the silence between them had shifted from uncomfortable to almost companionable. Clay found himself sharing anecdotes about the harsh realities of ranch life, the relentless struggle against nature. He spoke of a particularly brutal winter when he'd nearly lost his entire herd. He didn't realize how much he'd spoken until he saw the genuine interest in Sophie's eyes. "You never gave up, did you?" she'd said, her voice soft, admiring. "That takes a kind of courage I understand." He felt a strange warmth spread through him. He'd always seen himself as simply stubborn, driven by a need for solitude. But her words, unbidden and sincere, painted a different picture. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a desperate woman, but a brave one. He saw the resilience etched into her weary face, the unwavering resolve in her eyes. The outlaws were still out there, a threat looming beyond the swirling snow. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she wouldn't back down. And neither would he. Shadows on the horizon. The dawn arrived not with a gentle unveiling, but with a sharp, blinding clarity. The blizzard, which had raged with such ferocity, seemed to have simply exhausted itself, collapsing into a still, frigid silence. Clay stepped out onto the porch, the air biting at his exposed skin, but the cold was a welcome counterpoint to the suffocating oppression of the storm. The world was transformed, a stark canvas of white stretching to the horizon. The usually rugged landscape softened and smoothed under a thick blanket of snow. Sunlight, weak and watery, glinted off the untouched drifts, making him squint. He scanned the immediate vicinity of the ranch house, his gaze sweeping over the barn and the small corrals. Everything was encased in an icy shell, pristine and undisturbed. He walked to the edge of the porch, then down the steps, his boots crunching loudly in the virgin snow. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of melting ice from the eaves. It was a beautiful, treacherous peace. His eyes, accustomed to reading the land, sought out any sign of disruption. Nothing near the house. He walked a wider perimeter, heading towards the faint outline of the access road that snaked its way up to his isolated property. The snow here was deeper, less disturbed by wind eddies. He pushed through it, his breath pluming in the crisp air. Then he saw them. Not a single set of tracks, but several. Deep impressions, fresh against the overnight fall. Horse tracks. They weren't old, buried by the storm. These were laid after the heaviest snowfall, partially obscured by the final, lighter flurries. They led directly towards his ranch. His gut tightened with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. The outlaws. They hadn't been deterred by the blizzard. They'd merely been slowed. They were here, or very close. Clay straightened, his jaw hardening. He followed the tracks a short distance, confirming their direction and the number of animals. At least 3 horses, maybe 4. They were moving deliberately, not in a panicked flight. He knew what that meant. They were hunting. And the prey was Sophie and Lily. He turned and strode back towards the house, the peaceful morning shattered. He burst through the door, the sudden warmth of the cabin a brief, forgotten comfort. Sophie was by the stove, warming a pot of water, Lily gurgling softly in a makeshift sling she'd fashioned from a blanket, secure against her chest. She looked up, startled by his abrupt entrance. Her eyes, usually weary, now held a flicker of apprehension. "They're here," Clay stated, his voice devoid of emotion, clipped and sharp. Sophie's face paled, the last vestiges of sleep fading, replaced by a fierce alertness. She clutched Lily tighter. How do you know? Tracks, fresh. Came in after the worst of the storm. They're closing in. He walked to the window, peering out, but the tracks were not visible from this vantage point. We don't have much time. What do we do? Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. We prepare. Clay began pulling boards from a stack he kept for winter repairs, tossing them onto the floor with a clatter. This cabin's solid, but it's got windows. Too many for my liking right now. He grabbed a hammer and a box of nails. You can help. Get any heavy furniture you can move. Block the doors. Secure anything loose. Sophie didn't hesitate. She carefully settled Lily in a sturdy wooden cradle Clay had retrieved from the storage room, then started dragging an old wooden chest against the front door. They'll see the tracks to the house. They'll know we're here. Of course they will, Clay grunted, already hammering a board across the first window. The sound echoed through the small cabin, a rhythmic, violent punctuation to the rising tension. They're not subtle. They just want what they came for. And now, they'll know I'm here too. He paused, looking at her over his shoulder. They'll be expecting a man, but not me. He moved with a practiced efficiency, his movements economical and strong. Sophie, despite her exhaustion, matched his urgency, her smaller frame straining to push a heavy wardrobe in front of a window facing the back of the house. The cabin, which had felt like a refuge, slowly began to transform into a fortress. Each boarded window, each piece of furniture pushed into place, was a defiant act against the encroaching danger. Do you have weapons? Sophie asked, her voice low, as she helped him maneuver a thick wooden table against another window. Enough, Clay replied, his eyes scanning the room, already planning his defensive positions. More than enough for a few outlaws. The question is, how many? And how desperate? He pulled a rifle from a rack above the fireplace, checked the chamber, then leaned it against the wall. They won't expect resistance. That's our advantage. They think they're hunting a lone woman and a baby. He looked at her, his gaze sharp. They're about to learn otherwise. A cold certainty settled in the air, thick and palpable. The storm had passed, but the real threat had only just begun to emerge from the shadows on the horizon. The outlaws arrive. The wind, which had been a mournful lament since dawn, abruptly shifted, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke and damp horseflesh. Clay, peering through a narrow slit in the boarded window, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The tracks he'd discovered were no phantom. They were here. He could hear Sophie's quick, shallow breaths behind him. The soft coo of Lily a stark contrast to the grim reality unfolding outside. They're coming, he murmured, not needing to turn to know she was gripping the rifle he'd given her, knuckles white. A moment later, 5 figures emerged from the swirling snow and skeletal trees, dark silhouettes against the bruised sky. They rode without fanfare, a silent, menacing procession. At their head was a man on a powerfully built roan, his presence radiating an undeniable authority. Even from this distance, Clay could sense the cold calculation in his movements. This had to be Silas. They dismounted 20 yards from the cabin, their movements practiced, economical. One man, burly and slow-moving, began to circle the barn. Another 2 fanned out, their eyes scanning the perimeter. Silas, however, stood his ground, his gaze fixed on the cabin, a predatory intensity in his dark eyes. "Clay Morgan!" His voice, though not particularly loud, carried an icy command that cut through the wind. "We know she's in there. Hand over the girl and the child, and no one gets hurt." Clay remained silent, his own rifle barrel gleaming dully in the dim light. He could feel Sophie's hand tremble as she rested it on his shoulder. Her fear was palpable, a tangible weight in the small, cramped room. Silas took a step forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a Bowie knife tucked into his belt. "Don't be foolish, Morgan. This doesn't concern you. It's a family matter." A cruel smile touched his lips. "My brother's brat. A little piece of property that went missing." "Property doesn't have a soul," Clay retorted, his voice raspy from disuse and tension. Silas's smile vanished. "That's where you're wrong, rancher. That child belongs to us, and we'll have her back, one way or another." He gestured vaguely at the cabin. "You think a few planks of wood will stop us? We'll burn you out, smoke you like a badger from its hole." A shudder ran through Sophie. Lily, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to whimper. Sophie pulled her closer, murmuring soothing words against the baby's head. Clay's jaw tightened. "Burn them out." The words painted a terrifying picture in his mind. The ranch, his home, consumed by fire, and the three of them trapped inside. But the thought of handing over Lily, of letting Silas claim what wasn't his, was an even more bitter pill. He pushed away from the window, moving toward the reinforced door. "Get back," he ordered Sophie, his voice low and firm. "Stay out of sight." She hesitated, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Clay, no, don't." "I said, get back." He didn't wait for her to comply, throwing open the door just enough to squeeze through, rifle raised. The biting wind instantly lashed at him, stinging his eyes. He stood silhouetted against the dark interior of the cabin, a solitary figure facing 5 armed men. The snow-dusted ground crunched under his boots. Silas's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise in their depths, quickly replaced by cold amusement. "Well, well, look at the brave little rancher, playing hero." "You're trespassing," Clay stated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Get off my land." One of the outlaws, a lanky man with a scarred cheek, snickered. "Or what, old man? You gonna shoot all 5 of us?" Clay didn't dignify the question with an answer. He shifted his weight, the rifle feeling heavy and familiar in his grip. He met Silas's gaze, unflinching. "I won't let you take her." Silas's lips thinned. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, Morgan. This isn't a barroom brawl. You're protecting a thief, a murderer. My brother died because of her." "She told me you killed your own brother," Clay countered, a challenge in his tone. The air crackled with tension. Silas's face darkened, a vein throbbing in his temple. "She lied. She's a manipulative whore. She stole my brother's child and ran. Now you have one last chance, Morgan. Step aside, or you'll regret it." Clay adjusted his grip on the rifle, the wood cold against his cheek. He had never been much for grand declarations, but The words that came next were born of a fierce, unexpected conviction. I'm not stepping aside. A sudden gust of wind swept across the clearing, kicking up a swirl of snow between Clay and the outlaws. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats. The standoff had begun. The wind howled a mournful tune around the cabin, mimicking the churning fear in Sophie's gut. Silas's words, sharp as flint, had cut through the din, leaving a cold residue. Lily, oblivious, stirred slightly in her bundled warmth. Sophie's gaze flickered to Clay, his face etched with a grim resolve that both comforted and terrified her. He was a wall, but even walls could crumble under relentless assault. "There's another way out," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising gale. Clay's eyes, dark and intense, met hers, a question in their depths. "The cellar. There's an old tunnel, connects to the creek bed. My father, he built it for emergencies. He said, always have a back door, Sophie girl." A flicker of surprise crossed Clay's features, quickly replaced by a calculating glint. He didn't ask how she knew about the tunnel, or why her father might have needed such a thing. Not now. "How old is it?" he murmured, his gaze sweeping the sturdy but aging cabin. "Old enough to be forgotten by most, but it's sound. He reinforced it. I saw him." Her voice held a desperate urgency. "You create a distraction. I'll take Lily. Once we're clear, you can—" "No," Clay cut her off, his tone firm. "We stick together." He wasn't about to let her face those men alone, nor was he about to abandon a child. The thought was a raw, unfamiliar ache in his chest. "I'll give you time, enough to get Lily out, and then I'll follow. We meet at the big cottonwood by the Eastern Fork." Sophie hesitated, a battle waging in her eyes. The idea of leaving him to face Silas's wrath alone was a bitter pill, yet the alternative, Lily caught in a crossfire, was unthinkable. "All right," she finally conceded, her voice tight. "Don't be a hero, Clay. Just get out." He offered a curt nod, then moved with a sudden, decisive energy. "Cover your ears, little one," he mumbled to Lily, though she wouldn't understand. He kicked a loose floorboard near the hearth, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and smelled of damp earth and old wood. "Go," he commanded, his eyes urging her on. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. "I'll draw their attention, give you a head start." Sophie clutched Lily tighter, a silent prayer forming on her lips. She slipped through the opening, careful not to scrape the baby against the rough edges. The moment she was through, Clay replaced the board with practiced ease, then moved to the front door. A crash of splintering wood echoed through the cabin as Clay, with a grunt of exertion, shoved the heavy dining table against the front door, effectively barricading it. Outside, Silas's voice boomed, laced with impatience. "Morgan, you ain't got all night. Send out the girl and the squalling brat or we'll burn you out." Clay ignored him. He moved to a small, high window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peer out. He could see two figures, shadowy forms against the moonlit snow, crouched near the barn. He hefted a heavy, leather-bound volume, a forgotten ledger, and hurled it through the glass with a resounding shatter. "You want to fight, Silas?" Clay roared, his voice thick with feigned rage. "Then come and get it." Below, in the inky blackness of the cellar, Sophie shuddered at the sound of breaking glass and Clay's defiant shout. The sudden cold blast of air from the broken window above confirmed his diversion. She fumbled for the lantern she'd seen Clay use earlier, her fingers trembling as she struck a match. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the packed earth walls, revealing a narrow, low-ceilinged passage leading away from the cabin's foundation. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and something else, something faintly metallic and ancient. Lily whimpered softly against her shoulder, sensing the shift in her mother's mood, the accelerated rhythm of her heart. Sophie whispered soothing words, patting the tiny back, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. The tunnel was claustrophobic, the rough-hewn walls pressing in, the ceiling so low she had to stoop, her back aching already. Dust motes danced in the lantern's weak glow. Each step was cautious, her boots crunching on loose gravel and dry leaves that had blown in from the distant exit. She imagined the outlaws, their heavy boots tramping through the snow above, their malevolent eyes scanning for any sign of movement. She could almost feel their hateful stares, even through the layers of earth and wood. She moved as quickly as she dared, her ears straining for any sound from above. A gunshot, a shout, anything to indicate Clay's fate. The silence, punctuated only by the distant wail of the wind and the faint gurgle of unseen water, was more terrifying than any noise. It meant she was alone in this subterranean world, responsible for the precious life in her arms, utterly cut off from the man who was risking everything for them. A desperate, primal instinct propelled her forward, one foot in front of the other, through the cold, dark earth, towards an uncertain freedom. The fight for home. The groan of floorboards overhead solidified Sophie's terror, amplifying the hurried steps of men dangerously close. The tunnel, a passage reeking of damp earth, stretched interminably, each step a testament to her waning courage. Lily, a fragile bundle, whimpered softly against her shoulder, a tiny beacon of life in the suffocating dark. The air grew thick with pine and gunpowder as Sophie neared the creek bed, the faint promise of dawn a distant glimmer. She burst into the cool morning air, the creek gurgling a nearby welcome. Scrambling up the bank, Sophie plunged into a thicket of willows, her gaze sweeping Clay's ranch, now a battleground. A gunshot tore the air, followed by the splinter of wood. Clay. He was making his stand. The thought propelled her onward, away from immediate peril. Yet her heart clamored for news of his safety. She moved with purpose, a shadow clinging to the deeper undergrowth, meager cover against the rising light. Back at the cabin, Clay moved with the efficiency of a seasoned hunter, a whirlwind of instinct. He knew this land, every undulation and ancient oak, intimately. That intimate knowledge was his weapon now. Silas's men, a motley crew of ruffians, spread out, their shouts carving through the morning stillness. Clay fired, a single precise shot felling the lead horse, sending its rider tumbling. He retreated into the cabin, slamming the door shut and bracing it with a groaning oak table. "Come out, Morgan!" Silas's voice boomed, thick with menace. "We know you're in there." Clay offered no reply. He moved to a narrow window, peering through a slit in the shutters. 3 figures circled the cabin, rifles raised. He waited, a predator's patience, until one paused to reload. He fired, the blast shaking the small room. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as his rifle clattered to the ground. Another shot from outside impacted the wall beside Clay's head, showering him with splinters. He ducked, reloading with practiced economy. This fight transcended the ranch. It was for Sophie, for Lily. A fierce, protective surge, foreign yet potent, coursed through him. He would not permit their harm. Not on his watch. Meanwhile, Sophie, believing she'd gained sufficient distance, found a sheltered hollow among a cluster of boulders. She gently laid Lily down, loosening her swaddling to check for dampness. Lily cooed, tiny hands reaching for Sophie's face. A twig snapped nearby. Sophie froze, her hand instinctively covering Lily's mouth. Silas emerged from the shadows, his gaunt face twisted into a sneer, eyes like chips of obsidian. "Well, well, what have we here?" he drawled, his voice a chilling whisper devoid of warmth. He held a revolver, its barrel gleaming in the pale light. "Thought you could just vanish, little bird." Sophie's breath hitched. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She shielded Lily with her body, her eyes blazing defiance. "Leave us be, Silas," she snarled, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coiling in her gut. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Not a chance. You're carrying something that belongs to me, and I mean to retrieve it." He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on Lily. "And the brat, she's coming with me." A cold dread permeated Sophie's bones. She clutched Lily tighter, her mind scrambling for an escape, any avenue of flight. There was none. The boulders offered no sanctuary from a man so ruthless, so determined. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fleeting moment, bracing for the inevitable. Suddenly, a shot ripped through the air, not from Silas's gun, but from beyond. Silas grunted, staggering back, his hand flying to his leg. He spun, eyes wide with surprise and pain. Clay. He burst from the thicket, rifle smoking, face grim. He moved with a speed Sophie hadn't witnessed, a raw, untamed force. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, a silent pact of reassurance passing between them. Then he was upon Silas, a whirlwind of fists and fury. The two men grappled, a desperate, brutal struggle for dominance. Silas, weakened by his injury, fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but Clay's rage was a force of nature. He landed a punishing blow to Silas's jaw, sending him sprawling. Clay's foot descended on Silas's wrist, pinning his gun hand. With a swift, decisive motion, he kicked the revolver away. Silas lay defeated, a snarl twisting his bloodied face. Clay stood over him, breathing heavily, chest heaving. The ranch, once a quiet haven, hummed with the aftermath of violence. The other outlaws, hearing Silas's cry and seeing their leader incapacitated, had scattered, melting back into the wilderness. Sophie scrambled to her feet, Lily still clutched in her arms. She looked at Clay, her rescuer, a man transformed by battle. The distrust that had once clouded his eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. He met her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in shared peril. He had come for them. He had fought for them. He had fought for home. Teamwork and triumph. The air crackled with a primal energy as Clay, still grappling with the downed Silas, saw the glint of another blade. One of Silas's remaining henchmen, a wiry man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, lunged. Clay reacted on instinct, twisting Silas's arm and using his weight to send the outlaw sprawling. The rancher then pivoted, meeting the new assailant with a hard, right hook that snapped the man's head back and sent him stumbling. But there was a third. This one, bigger and slower, was already raising a battered shotgun. Time seemed to stretch. Clay, still off balance from his last move, knew he couldn't reach him in time. Then a blur of motion. Sophie, her face streaked with dirt and determination, erupted from behind a rain barrel. She slammed into the shotgun wielder's legs with surprising force, sending him toppling with a grunt. The shotgun skittered across the wet ground, harmless. Before the man could recover, Sophie snatched up a discarded length of rope, swiftly binding his ankles. "Good work," Clay grunted, finally securing Silas's wrists with a belt he'd pulled from his own pants. Sophie, breathing heavily, met his gaze. There was no fear there now, only a fierce resolve that mirrored his own. Together, they quickly disarmed and tied the remaining two men. The rain had begun to ease, replaced by a fine mist that clung to the leaves, yet the tension in the air remained palpable. Lily, miraculously, had slept through most of the chaos, her soft snores a stark contrast to the rough sounds of struggle. Clay surveyed their makeshift prison, the three outlaws trussed like holiday turkeys near the porch. He looked at Sophie, her usually pristine clothes torn and muddy, her hair escaping its braid in damp tendrils. You did good, Sophie," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He wasn't one for effusive praise. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "You too, Clay. We make a pretty good team, it seems." He grunted, not disagreeing. They sat for a time, watching the bound men, listening to the drip of water from the eaves. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets, now emerging after the storm. Suddenly, the distant thrum of an engine. Clay's head snapped up. It wasn't a sound he often heard on his isolated ranch. A moment later, the distinct, rhythmic clatter of horses' hooves joined the engine's drone. Sophie's eyes lit up. "The sheriff! He got my message!" Clay looked at her, confused. "Message? What message?" She pointed to the weather vane atop the barn. "When I was hiding in the loft, I rigged it with a piece of reflective tin and set it to spin when the wind picked up just so. It's angled to catch the morning sun in a specific way, a signal I used to use with my father when we were out on the range. It can be seen from the road to town, if you know what you're looking for." A slow grin spread across Clay's face. Clever. Very clever. The engine grew louder, and then a Ford Model T pickup dusted with red dirt rumbled into view, followed by two riders on horseback. Sheriff Brody, a barrel-chested man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a worn Stetson, was at the wheel. He slammed on the brakes, sending a spray of gravel. His deputies dismounted, hands already on their holsters. Brody's eyes, sharp and assessing, took in the scene. Clay and Sophie standing guard, and the three notorious outlaws hog-tied on the ground. His gaze lingered on Sophie's disheveled appearance, then on Lily, now stirring in her arms. "Well, I'll be," Brody muttered, stepping out of the truck. "Heard a mighty strange report from one of my boys on patrol. Said he saw a light flashing from your place, Clay. Figured it was worth checking out." He pulled out a pair of spectacles and peered at the weather vane. "Never would have guessed." "They tried to take Lily," Sophie explained, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Silas and his men." Brody knelt beside Silas, nudging him with his boot. "So, the notorious Silas finally got caught, eh? And by a woman and a rancher, no less." He looked up at Clay, a hint of admiration in his eyes. You've been busy, Clay. Reckon you've earned yourself a good night's sleep. The deputies, efficient and professional, began to untie the outlaws, replacing their makeshift bonds with sturdy handcuffs. Silas, his face a mask of fury and defeat, was roughly hoisted to his feet. He glared at Clay, then at Sophie, a promise of future vengeance in his cold eyes. But Clay met his gaze, unflinching. The rancher's stance communicated an unwavering protective instinct that brooked no further threats. As the outlaws were loaded into the back of the pickup, their curses muffled by the rising dawn, a strange sense of quiet descended upon the ranch. The immediate danger had passed, leaving in its wake a shared exhaustion and an unspoken understanding between Clay and Sophie. Brody approached them, tipping his hat. "We'll take these fellas off your hands. You two should get some rest. We'll need your statements in town, of course, when you're up to it." He glanced at Lily, now awake and blinking sleepily. "Looks like you've got quite a story to tell." As the sheriff's vehicle and horses disappeared down the winding dirt road, the morning sun finally broke through the lingering clouds, bathing the ranch in a soft, golden light. Clay looked at Sophie, then at the baby nestled against her. A new chapter had begun on his solitary ranch, one he never anticipated, but one he was ready to embrace. An unexpected family. The last vestiges of the morning storm had surrendered to a sky scrubbed clean, a pale blue vault stretching endlessly above the ranch. The air, still cool and damp, carried the fresh scent of pine and wet earth, a stark contrast to the acrid tang of gunpowder that had permeated the house just hours before. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the soft click of the grandfather clock in the hall and Lily's contented gurgles from the blanket on the floor. Clay stood by the window, watching the sheriff's buggy disappear down the winding track, its dust plume a final, fading echo of the chaos. His shoulders, which had been hunched with tension for days, now seemed to sag with a weariness that went bone deep. He'd faced down wrestlers, endured harsh winters, and wrestled with his own demons, but nothing had prepared him for the sudden, violent upheaval of his solitary existence. Yet, looking at Sophie, who knelt beside Lily, a soft smile gracing her lips as the baby clutched her finger, a strange lightness bloomed in his chest. Their gazes met across the room, an unspoken language passing between them. Sophie's eyes, though still shadowed with fatigue, held a newfound peace, a vulnerability that hadn't been present when she'd been fighting for her life. Clay saw the faint smudge of dirt on her cheek, the way a stray strand of hair clung to her forehead, and a protective instinct, fierce and unexpected, surged through him. He hadn't asked for this, for them, but now that they were here, the thought of them leaving felt like a wrenching amputation. Lily, oblivious to the momentous shift in the adults' lives, let out a joyful squeal, kicking her plump legs. Sophie scooped her up, holding her close, a picture of quiet devotion. "She's hungry," Sophie murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper in the quiet room. Clay nodded, pushing away from the window. I can heat some milk." It felt like a clumsy offering, a rancher's practical solution to a domestic need. He hadn't made milk for a baby in, well, never. His kitchen, usually a place of quick, solitary meals, now felt imbued with a new purpose. As he moved to the stove, the clatter of pots and pans seemed unusually loud. Sophie followed him, Lily nestled in her arms, her head resting on Sophie's shoulder. The small kitchen, which had always felt spacious, now felt intimately crowded with their presence. He poured milk into a small saucepan, his hands, calloused and strong from years of ranch work, feeling surprisingly delicate as he adjusted the flame. "It's quiet now," Sophie said, her voice barely audible above the gentle hiss of the milk warming. Clay glanced over his shoulder. She was watching him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Yeah, too quiet sometimes." He hadn't realized how much he'd grown accustomed to the low hum of her presence, the soft rustle of her movements, Lily's occasional cries. The silence, once a comfort, now felt stark, a reminder of the emptiness that had preceded them. He stirred the milk, the aroma of warm dairy filling the small space. "What now, Sophie?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. She shifted Lily in her arms, her gaze drifting to the window, where the sun was now painting the distant hills in hues of gold and amber. I don't know." Her voice was laced with an uncertainty he hadn't heard before. "Silas is gone. Lily is safe. I suppose I should take her to the orphanage in town. That was always the plan after I reached the sheriff." The words struck Clay like a physical blow. The orphanage. He hadn't considered it, hadn't allowed himself to. The image of Lily, so small and vulnerable, in the care of strangers, sent a cold dread through him. And Sophie. The thought of her walking away, leaving this ranch, leaving him, was suddenly unbearable. He turned from the stove, the saucepan forgotten. "No." The word was raw, abrupt. Sophie looked at him, startled. "Clay?" He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her and the baby. "No," he repeated, his voice softer now, but imbued with a fierce conviction. She's safe here, with us." He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing Lily's soft cheek. The baby's tiny hand reached up, gripping his finger with surprising strength. Sophie's eyes, wide and luminous, searched his. He saw surprise there, and then, slowly, a dawning understanding. He wasn't just talking about Lily. He was talking about them. "Us?" she whispered, the word a fragile question. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "This ranch, it's been empty for too long. It feels different now. Better." He wasn't good with words, never had been. But the feeling in his gut, the warmth spreading through his chest, was undeniable. This wasn't just about protecting them from outlaws. It was about protecting them for life. A tear, unbidden, tracked a path down Sophie's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she leaned into him, Lily a warm bundle between them. He wrapped an arm around both of them, pulling them close, the unfamiliar weight a welcome comfort. The scent of her hair, the soft curve of her back, the rhythmic thrum of Lily's tiny heart against his arm. It all felt profoundly right. Outside, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, its branches swaying in a slow, peaceful dance. The harsh realities of the past few days seemed to recede, replaced by the quiet promise of the future. Clay, the solitary rancher, had found his unexpected family, and in the heart of that quiet ranch, under the vast, open sky, a new chapter, unforeseen and beautiful, had just begun. He pressed a kiss to Sophie's hair, then to Lily's soft head, a silent vow hanging in the air. This was their home now.